Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to the 32nd anniversary of the Imam Khomeini program. I'm going to start off with the recitation of the Holy Quran, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله واتقوا الله إن الله سميع عليم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا ترفعوا أصواتكم فوق صوت النبي ولا تجهروا له بالقول كجهر بعضكم لبعض أن تحبط أعمالكم وأنتم لا تشعرون. إن الذين يغضون أصواتهم عند رسول الله أولئك الذين امتحن الله قلوبهم للتقوى لهم مغفرة وأجر عظيم. إن الذين ينادونك من وراء الحجرات أكثرهم لا يعقلون ولو أنهم صبروا حتى يخرج إليهم لكان خيرا لهم والله غفور رحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا أن يصيبوا قوما بجهالة فتصبحوا على ما فعلتم نادمين. واعلموا أن فيكم رسول الله لو يطيعكم في كثير من الأمر لأنتم ولكن الله حبب إليكم الإيمان وزينه في قلوبكم وكره إليكم الكفر والفسوق والعصيان أولئك هم الراشدون فضلا من الله ونعمة والله عليم حكيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I want to take you back in time a bit. I want to take you back to 1977. Leonid Brezhnev is the leader of the Soviet Union, and Jimmy Carter is the president of the United States. The world, for the most part, is split between the First World, those who are aligned with the West, which is headlined by the US, and the Second World, those who support the East, headlined by the Soviet Union. Everyone not in one of these two camps or being courted by them is termed the Third World, and they're thought to be inconsequential with little to no significance. Iran at this time is ruled by the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who's a staunch ally of the US. And then we come to the year 1978. And in that year, we see a multitude of protests in Iran, all of which lead to the culmination and all of which culminate with the formation of the Islamic Republic in February of 1979. This abrupt change, which took place in between a year to half a year, was completely unforeseen by most people, and it caught the world by surprise. By establishing a true Islamic government based on the Sharia as well as with the acceptance of the people, Imam Khomeini offered the world a fourth position, one which was neither West nor East, nor one that could be ignored. It was the position of Islam. It's only now, several decades later, that we're truly able to see the fruits of his labor, which are maturing each and every day, and the tremendous effects that he has had on both the world at large and Muslims in particular, directly and indirectly. Just to mention a few, the revival and renaissance of Islam, the increasing strength and image of Muslims around the globe, and the increased unity between Muslims are all examples of affairs which were heading towards a dismal and dark future only to be turned around by Imam Khomeini's work. These are just a few of the examples out of the countless out there, but it suffices to say that you would be hard pressed to find an area of the world which has not been impacted by Imam Khomeini in one way or another. My esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, kids, and everyone else joining us today, I'd like to welcome you to our program commemorating Imam Khomeini's death anniversary. The focus for today's program, as you might already know, is on the effect that Imam Khomeini had on the world, and we'll be doing this by looking at and discussing what the world might have looked like today had Imam Khomeini not done all that he did. With us today, we have our keynote speakers, Sheikh Salim Yusuf Ali, Brother Afif Khan, and Mr. Phil Wilayato, as well as some poets and spoken word artists who will perform their pieces during the course of today's program. We'll also be watching a couple of videos related to Imam Khomeini and what he did. With that, let us start off today's program with some poetry from Sister Gula Zahra.
Assalamu alaikum. I will be reciting a poem called Light from Above. A brilliant light gifted from above, inspiring others of God's love, opening our hearts and opening our mind. By his words, peace is what we find. Today we remember one great leader, intellectual visionary, and a strong believer. He was strong and he was determined. He was wise and he was certain. Known best for driving the Shah off his throne, Ruhollah Khomeini is how he is known. He showed us how to be spiritually secure. Relying on Allah is the heart's only cure. In the event of his son's demise, he says the death is a hidden blessing of God the All-Wise. Working by day and supplicating at night for Allah to be pleased, he says, working for the love of God never makes me fatigued. O Allah, don't humiliate me in front of the people on the day of resurrection, murmured from the core of his heart with such sincerity and affection. For the key to being like him is to master the revolution within, to keep alive the spark in us. We must keep Islam as the focus. When asked advice on spiritual purification, a short response with no needed explanation. Endeavor to perform good deeds, but make them sincere in order to succeed. Give special significance to reciting the Quran, recite the special supplications by the prophets and imams, do dhikr of Allah with every movement, recite du'as and pray for self-improvement. The pleasure of worshiping God is attained in the youth, so O young ones, take advantage, for this is the truth. When problems arise, don't feel alone. Put your faith in God and God alone. And following the spiritual growth, we can reflect on the oath, the promise we made to our 12th Imam to aid justice and preserve the teachings of Islam, to be informed and politically active, to fight the oppressors and speak up against the tyrants. Jazakallah.
Thank you, Sister Gula Zahra, for that wonderful poem. I especially liked how you highlighted the relationship between Imam Khomeini and God and his religiosity. There's definitely no doubt in my mind, at least, that Imam Khomeini got where he did by his dedication to Islam and his dedication to Allah. With that, I'd like to continue with today's program, and I'd like to welcome our first speaker for today, Brother Afif Khan. Brother Afif Khan is the editor of the first ever tafsir or exegesis of the Quran written in English by Imam Al-Asi, which is titled The Ascendant Quran. He is also on the editorial board of Crescent International magazine. Brother Afif, the floor, or should I say screen, is all yours.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الحمد وله الملك يحيي ويميت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير وأشهد أن محمدًا عبد الله ورسوله وصفيه وخليله أرسله الله للناس نذيرًا وبشيرًا. أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. And brothers and sisters, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for having me here today to share some comments with you on this important occasion. And inshallah, I hope that that our screen time is okay, that my connection does. A few words about myself. I'm sorry for the internet connection loss. My connection may be a little bit unstable, but nonetheless, I'll go on. Before I proceed with my comments, a few words about myself. I come from a traditionally Sunni background, so I do not use those labels in the modern day. And so those kinds of labels in the world today. But nonetheless, insofar as the Islamic Revolution in Iran is concerned, I came of age during that revolution. I was around 17 or 18 years old at the time, and I had the good fortune in my life of growing up with three larger-than-life Islamic personalities. As far as the first of those two are concerned, Malcolm X and Sayyid Qutb, I was too young to recognize the impact that they had on the Ummah. But insofar as Imam Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution in Iran are concerned, they are especially endeared to me because, as I said, I came of age during the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Most of us are now well aware, unless you've been living in a cave, about the incident that just happened last week in London, Ontario, where three generations of a Muslim family were basically murdered in broad daylight. And the instrument of their murder was a pickup truck that was driven by a young person. And from the information that has come out about the perpetrator, the research into his background indicates that he was the type of person that was playing video games well into the night until like 3 or 4 in the morning. And you know that in the war games that are played on video by many young people, that the existential enemy in those war games happen to be Muslims. They may call them terrorists, but by the names that are given to these terrorists and by the way that they're dressed and by the language that they're speaking, you recognize them to be Muslims. And so if you're being fed a steady diet of a stereotype of Muslims, then you may expect the kind of reactions which are taking place in these so-called free societies. Nonetheless, whatever happened in London, Ontario is obviously happening on a much larger scale in Palestine, in Yemen, in Mali, in Kashmir, in Burma, in quite a few hotspots all over the Muslim East and in the larger Muslim world. And on the face of it, you might say that this is happening because the Western neoliberal order has made it abundantly clear that the existential enemy of that neoliberal order is Islam and the Muslims. And the evidence of that fact is that since 9/11, somewhere like 32 million Muslims have either been killed or displaced in the broader Muslim world. And they've been killed or displaced not by their own hand, but by foreign invaders into their countries, and by groups within Muslim countries that have allied themselves to those foreign invaders. Now, in these neoliberal societies, there has been a nationalist and a fascist backlash. But even those nationalists and fascists, some of them obviously were being led by President Trump in the last go-around of elections. They have also indicated that they feel that their existential enemy is Islam and the Muslims, and perhaps they're even more enthusiastic about calling Muslims their enemies. And so regardless of where you go in the world today, Muslims are being persecuted to some extent or another all over the world. But if you consider this issue of Muslim persecution all over the world a little bit more deeply, you might say to yourself that all of this is happening because an Islamic awakening took place in 1979, when Imam Khomeini came back to Islamic Iran and established an Islamic government, leading an Islamic society. You might say that all of this is today happening because of one man's resolve and determination to put Imperial America, Communist Russia, Zionist Israel, and Wahhabi Arabia on notice, that they are now going to be the targets of Islamic liberation activities and of an Islamic political restructuring. And obviously the man that I'm speaking of is the great Imam Khomeini. And we are here on this 32nd anniversary of his passing into heavenly company, rahmatullahi alayh. We are here on this 32nd anniversary to honor the man, the Imam, and the Mujaddid. For all of us know that a Mujaddid is someone who comes and revives Allah's deen, and that Allah sends a Mujaddid every 100 years to realign humanity and the Muslims in particular with his deen, Deenul Qayyim. It is often said that the world changed after 9/11. And it did change, but it changed for the worse. The richer, more predatory countries in the world just declared open season on the poor part of the world. The security situation in the world changed. A tremendous amount of surveillance and campaigns of surveillance were initiated by the power culture in the world, and mostly against the poor people or the suffering people in the world. But at the same time, it can be said that the world changed in 1979. But on the whole, the world changed for the better in 1979. And thus there's a qualitative difference between the change that took place in 1979 and the change that took place after 9/11. For the change that took place in 1979 is that at the time there were two superpowers, and these two superpowers thought that they were invincible. And within 10 years, one of those superpowers was gone. And its so-called influence on the second world, which was basically the communist socialist world. That influence was gone. And this empire faded away so quickly that it was gone without even the smallest trace of a whimper. And the other superpower that was engaged in a Cold War type of battle with the communist superpower, that superpower is on its way out. It has spent trillions of its own resources in order to abort the Islamic effort in Iran. And it may yet spend trillions of more dollars in order to try to destroy that Islamic awakening. And it may spend all of that money and all of those resources and peter itself out in trying to snuff out what Allah has declared as a victory for his system, his deen, his prophet, and his people. Another positive outcome of the Islamic awakening in 1979 that was led by the Imam is that an economic superpower emerged. And at the same time, the mustada'afin in the world, the oppressed in the world, finally had a champion. And the Muslims finally had a bona fide leader of their own after a good 80 or 90 years. Is it some kind of a coincidence that the apartheid in South Africa collapsed a mere 13 or 14 years after the Islamic Revolution in Iran? Wasn't it the Imam who gave motivation to the peoples, to the mustada'afin of the world, to the oppressed people of the world, to the people who were in what you might call a racist concentration camp in South Africa? Didn't he give them encouragement to rise up, that their momentum, the momentum of the people, the momentum that they had together could not be put down? And it wasn't enough for him to say this in his speeches. He went out and he demonstrated it, that the momentum of the people could not be reversed. And so he carried his people through an 8-year war, which was imposed on the Islamic Republic from forces all around the world, the communist world, the capitalist world, and many in the third world. They allied together to put down the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And through this 8-year war, the Imam backed up his words, and he proved to those who wanted liberation that in order to have this liberation, that you have to make some sacrifices. And he motivated his people to make those sacrifices. And to that end, the Islamic people of Iran, they gave up hundreds and thousands of shuhada so that this revolution could survive. For indeed, it was the Imam himself who said that this revolution is not for the Iranian people. This revolution is for Islam, it is for Allah, and it is for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Nelson Mandela spent 26 years in prison. But before that, our beloved Imam spent time in prison. And it was during that time, one of those stints in prison, that the functionaries of the Shah approached him. And they told him that, you know, this business of politics is very dirty. And we are very used to dealing with this business. Why do you want to get your hands dirty in this kind of business? Why don't you go to your houses and just teach? That is a clean affair. And that is when the Imam said his famous statement, that those who think that Islam and politics are separate, they don't understand Islam, and worse, they don't understand politics. That, brothers and sisters, is credibility. That is integrity. When you are willing to give up your life for principle, for Allah and for the Prophet, when you are willing to give up your freedom for principle, when you are willing to give up quality time with your families and security for principle. And the last time I checked, that is the stuff of which leaders should be made. And then after his sentence in prison, those authorities in the country felt they could no longer have him inside the country, and so they decided to exile him. And first they exiled him to Iraq, and then they sent him to Turkey. And from there they sent him to France. And when he was on his way to France, he said that was one of the saddest days in his life because he had to leave the Muslim world. And he was sad because not one Muslim country gave him asylum. Brothers and sisters, that is what is called love for your own. Even if that love goes unrequited, even if that love is not returned by people who do not know better. And the last time I checked, that is the stuff of what leaders are made. Let's take a walk down memory lane. When the Imam came back to Iran in 1979, the powers that be did not want to give up. They wanted to maintain control in that society, a society that they had controlled for the past several decades. They didn't want to give up the resources in that society. They didn't want the people to use the resources for their own advancement and for the advancement of the other oppressed people in the world. And so they appointed their own figurehead. And they said that they're going to establish an interim government with a prime minister that they chose. And if you might remember, the name of that prime minister was Shahbuz Bakhtiyar. Now, the person that they chose himself was imprisoned by the Shah. Some may have considered him to be a revolutionary. And he had indicated that he did not want a state-controlled media. And he wanted to institute land reforms so that those who worked the land would have a chance of ownership. And he also wanted to nationalize certain industries inside the country, the chief industry of which was the oil and the gas. And so this person, if you were to evaluate him politically and ideologically, you would say that he was a leftist and a socialist. And so why would those powers that be in the capitalist part of the world, the first world, the neoliberal world, why would they choose a capitalist, a socialist and a communist, a leftist, to rule over a country, especially since they were in the middle of a Cold War which was at its peak? And so you can see how much affinity they have to their own so-called principles. They would rather have a leftist in charge of a country when they were in a Cold War with the communist part of the world than to have an Islamic Imam rule over a country. And that he was in prison during the reign of the Shah, that the people might warm up to him. But this is why the people needed their Imam. Their Imam knew exactly what to do. And he said at that time that those who oppressed us under the Shah, any decision that they make is a false decision. And so he rejected their decision, and he rejected their interim government. And he assumed control of the Islamic government after he ascertained the bay'ah from the people. This, brothers and sisters, is called clarity. Another important quality of which leaders should be made. And now let's briefly consider how one of those superpowers fell and another economic superpower emerged. You might recall that when the Imam got back to Iran in February of 1979, in December of that same year, the US president in office at the time, Jimmy Carter, he signed an executive order to start an agitation in Afghanistan. And this agitation had two geostrategic objectives for the United States. The first of these was to draw in the Soviet Union and to give them their own Vietnam, to draw them in such a way that it would bleed the country economically and that the US would have a chance to win the Cold War. The second geostrategic objective, and this is the one that concerns us, is that they wanted to draw momentum away from the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Because when Imam Khomeini became the head of the Islamic government in Iran, all of the Muslims of the world, Sunni and Shia alike, were behind the revolution. They were supporting the revolution. And the people in the West, politically, they knew that if these Muslims came together, that it would be an immovable force for them to deal with. And so they had to try to figure out a way to divert the attentions or bifurcate the momentum that was being built behind the Islamic Revolution. And so what they decided to do is that they decided to create a Sunni Islamic revolution. And this was the genesis of the insurgency in Afghanistan. And to a large extent, unfortunately, it worked, because it sucked away a lot of the Sunni support for the Islamic revolution in Iran and directed it toward a contrived insurgency in Afghanistan, which was mainly designed to weaken the Soviet Union. But it was presented in such a way that it was an Islamic insurgency against godless communism. And the Imam tried his best to convince people that this is a contrived insurgency, that it is not an organic Islamic movement. But at that time, to no avail, because he was in the midst of an 8-year war for the existence of the Islamic Republic in Iran. You might recall that at the time, the United States could not give weapons directly to the Afghan so-called mujahideen. And that was because of certain conventions and treaties that it had signed. For if it was to give weapons directly, then the Soviet Union could have taken the United States to the United Nations, and it could have won a whole bunch of political capital in doing so. And so what the United States decided to do is to get Saudi Arabia involved and to send something on the order of $600 million to the Chinese, so that the Chinese would send Chinese weapons to the insurgency in Afghanistan. And so for the first 5 or 6 years of that insurgency, the Afghan insurgency was using Chinese weapons. And this money that Saudi Arabia sent to the Chinese, this was the basis of the cheap manufacturing platform that the Chinese built. This was the genesis of the rise of China as an economic power. And most people do not know this story, nor do they look to try to discover how China began to rise as an economic power. But it has everything to do with the Imam coming back to Islamic Iran and to try to suck the momentum away from that Islamic awakening that was taking place in Islamic Iran. And now, to conclude my talk in just a few minutes, I want to say a few things about the war of words, which has never ceased against the Islamic Republic of Iran ever since its inception in 1979. It hasn't taken a break. There's been no hiatus. There's been no vacation. It has been a continuous barrage of propaganda, bombardment against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, you may recall that at the end of the imposed war, that 8-year war that Saddam Hussein, he was at the head of it, but almost the entire rest of the world was behind it. At the end of that 8-year imposed war, a new administration was taking office right here in the United States, and that was the elder Bush administration, the George H.W. Bush administration. It was just coming into office. And beside Saddam's invasion of Kuwait during that administration, there were two other important events that happened during the elder Bush administration. The second of these events was that about halfway through the term of that administration, George H.W. Bush made a comment to the effect, and this was with regard to Israeli colonial expansion in the West Bank. He made some comment to the effect that he was the only one who was resisting the Israel lobby in the Congress. And within 2 years of his making that kind of statement, the economy tanked, and he was not elected for a second term. And this is despite the fact that this was a wartime president who was coming out of a military engagement that the United States won pretty securely. It was a pretty one-sided victory. And he was not elected for a second term. And again, this is despite the fact that he extorted hundreds of billions of dollars from the Arabian Gulf monarchies in return for security guarantees, and that money was brought back here to the United States. And that money was responsible for the investment that took place in the dot-coms, and that resulted in the dot-com boom of the 1990s here in the United States. Now, the other event that I'm talking about, and this is the one that's more important to us, especially with regard to our beloved Imam, is that in 1989, George H.W. Bush was about to assign some key positions in his cabinet and his staff to some individuals who in their distant background had some Arabs. One of these was John Sununu, his chief of staff. And just as he was about to do that, to have these people confirmed into their positions as cabinet secretaries or onto his staff, that's when the Rushdie affair broke in public. And as soon as that affair broke, then all of these Zionist insiders got into key cabinet positions in the elder Bush administration. Now, the Imam, when this Rushdie affair broke, we all know, the decree that he issued in the matter of Salman Rushdie and his book, The Satanic Verses. At the time, the Imam was just coming out of a war, an 8-year war. And during that 8-year war, the propaganda campaign against Islamic Iran never stopped. During that war, chemical weapons were used. The Islamic government in Iran approached the United Nations and said that these are banned chemical weapons, and the United Nations said not one word about the use of those chemical weapons inside of Islamic Iran, against the Muslims of Islamic Iran. Not in the same way, obviously, that they were saying, and they couldn't stop making noises when it came to accusing Bashar al-Assad of the use of chemical weapons. But at that time, they said nothing. And so when the Imam issued his famous decree against Salman Rushdie, the Western corporate Zionist media jumped all over this and said, look, this is the difference between a free society and a medieval Islamic society. They don't understand freedom of speech. They don't understand this, and they don't understand that. We are the free people in the world, and these people are taking us back to the Stone Ages. And so the Imam, he was well aware that a propaganda war always accompanies a military war. That a volley of words generally is no different than a volley of bullets. And he felt that whether you're dealing with those who manufacture bullets or with those who manufacture words, they're all part of the same army. And once again, and this is a sad commentary on all of us as Muslims, the Muslim scholarly establishment abandoned the Imam. Not one prominent scholar across the Muslim world gave support to the Imam in his decree against Salman Rushdie. Not one. And so the Imam had to stand alone. But he was a tower of strength. And he stood against the barrage that came from the Zionist corporate media and the silence that came from the Islamic clerical establishment. This, brothers and sisters, is called courage. Another key quality that leaders should be made of. And we should demand as much from our leaders today. But sadly, this is not what we expect from our leaders. And in fact, we have demanded so little from our leaders that there is a movement within the Islamic Republic that is figuring or trying to reverse all of the gains that were made by the Imam and by Wilayat al-Faqih. They're trying to slowly undo everything that the Imam did. Now, whether this movement is going to gain traction inside the country, or there are enough of those who are on the line of the Imam and still willing to give their lives to protect and to have this Islamic revolution live well into the future. Whether there are enough of those, we pray for them. And we hope that Allah continues to shine His light upon this revolution, those shuhada who gave their lives to ensure the success of this revolution, and finally to the Imam who led us all into this new generation of an Islamic awakening. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه يغفر لكم فاسترشدوه يرشدكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you so much, Brother Afif. There's definitely some points that I'm sure many of us will be thinking about for several days to come at the very least. I wanted to point out two different things that really stuck out in your talk right there. One of the things that I really didn't know about before was the Chinese rise of an influence being tied to the success of the revolution in Iran. Like you mentioned, I think that's something that very few people have heard of, and that trace that you pointed out is something that's very it's kind of hidden for most of us. We know that the US supported the Taliban in their insurgency against the Soviets, but we don't know how everyone else played into it. So thank you for pointing that out. And then another thing that also really stuck out for us was, as you put it, the clarity, and I understood it to also be the basira that Imam Khomeini had as well. Those are definitely that's definitely a very important quality that we should expect of all of our leaders, and something that I think we should all work towards getting for ourselves as well, inshallah. Thank you so much for your words. Inshallah, we'll continue today's program with a video about some of the aspects of Imam Khomeini that made him a great leader. If I could ask the team to put that video up on the screen.
با اون تعبیر من الله علی المؤمنین، فرستادن پیغمبر، از این آیه شریفه استفاده می شد که اصل آمدن پیغمبر برای آموزش و پرورش بوده است. آیات را تلاوت کند، آیات را، علومی که از اون علوم همه به طور آیه نظر بشد، آیات را تلاوت کند برشون و تزکیه کند اونها را تطهیر کند، نفوس را تطهیر کند. بعد از این که تطهیر کرد یعلمهم الکتاب و الحکمه. پرورش قبل از آموزش است. اگرم قبل نباشد همراه باید باشند و رتبه او مقدم است. اگر چنانچه نفوس تزکیه نشند، تطهیر نشند، از اون اوصاف فاسد بیرون نرند، علم اثر سوء در اونها میکند. تمام ادیان باطل را علما اختراع کردند، دانشمندها اختراع کردند، برای اینکه علم وارد شده بود در یک جایی که پرورش نداشته، تزکیه نشده. وقتی که علم آمد در جایی که تزکیه نشده، این عالم که حامل این علم است و مزکا هم نیست خطرناک میشد برای جامعه. فرقی نیست ما بین علمای روحانی و علمای دانشگاهی و غیره. اگر در حوزه های علمیه و همینطور در دانشگاه ها تزکیه نباشد، این علم هایی که در اونجا انباشته میشد یک انباری است که خدای تعالی این تعبیر را درش فرموده: مثل الذین حملوا التوراة ثم لم یحملوها کمثل الحمار یحمل اسفارا. اون کسی که حتی علم توحید را، علم ادیان را، علم اخلاق را، همه این علوم را دارد لکن تزکیه نکرده نفسش را، این یک موجود خطرناک میشد برای جامعه.
That's definitely a great reminder for all of us, especially, coming from our tradition of studies in the West, where knowledge is mostly taken to be secular. It's definitely important for us to keep in mind that we're going to get wherever we get in life with self-purification. Just knowledge isn't enough. We need to make sure we're purifying our souls, and that we're also trying to apply our knowledge for the sake of Allah, inshallah. Our next speaker for today is Mr. Phil Williado. Mr. Phil Williado is the editor of the Virginia Defender, a quarterly newspaper based in Richmond, Virginia, in the U.S. He's been a lifelong anti-war activist. He was an organizer in 1979 of one of the only protests in the U.S. demanding that the deposed Shah of Iran be sent home to stand trial for his crimes against the Iranian people. He has traveled twice to Iran and is the author of the book, Defending Iran, Notes from a U.S. Peace Delegation's Journey Through the Islamic Republic. I've had the good fortune to be able to read the book, and I definitely recommend it for someone who wants to kind of get an insider look at Iran. With that, Mr. Phil, the floor is all yours. Sorry, I believe your mic is muted. Could you just hit the unmute button?
I do that a lot. Thanks so much, and it's really an honor to be invited to participate in this program today. The Imam Khomeini was one of the seminal figures of the 20th century, and it's very helpful to try to imagine what the world may have been if he had not been around to play the role that he played. The topic I've been asked to address today is Palestine, Israel, and anti-Semitism. I was doing some research on the history of all three topics, and I've made some notes, and I want to roughly read from my notes, which is something I don't usually do, but I think it's, I want to make sure I get all the historical facts exactly correct, at least so far as I've been able to learn them. So Back in 2007, it was a Friday evening, July 20th, and five of us who had traveled from the U.S. As a peace delegation to learn more about Iran and be able to come back and explain why many of the calumnies and lies being directed against Iran were false. And on this Friday evening, we visited the University of Tehran, where Friday prayers were held, because it could accommodate thousands and thousands of worshipers. And we were invited to stand at the main platform by the speakers. And I noticed an inscription on the wall by Imam Khomeini, something to the effect of, "We will always stand by the Palestinian people in their struggle." And it struck me because it was the only issue that was singled out by a quote from the Imam. And it kind of brought home to me the importance of the Palestinian struggle for the importance of the Palestinian struggle to the Imam and to the Islamic Republic. Without Imam Khomeini, there may well not have been a revolution in 1979. Without the revolution, there would not have been an Islamic Republic, and without Iran, there would be little support for resistance movements in the region, resistance against Israel and Israel's master, the US government. The world itself would be a very different place with the United States government much more firmly in control, which of course is why Washington hates Iran so much. Opposition to Iran is called anti-Semitism. So let's examine both Israel and the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. We know that Jews have lived in historic Palestine for thousands of years. So have indigenous Palestinians and Christian Palestinians. And since the emergence of Islam in the 7th century, so have Muslims. And for most of that time, they all lived in peace. The emergence of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries provided a safe haven for Jewish people fleeing violent persecution in Europe. This included thousands of Jews who were forced out of Spain by the Christian government in 1492. Anti-Semitism then emerged in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century as a result of competing national interests between different peoples. It was a fairly modern development. Meanwhile, in Europe, Christian anti-Semitism was a constant threat. It was fueled by the New Testament passages blaming Jews for the death of Christ, but always there was an economic element, a desire to prohibit Jews from developing wealth. And in much of Europe during the Middle Ages, Jews were denied citizenship and its rights, barred from holding posts in government and the military, and excluded from membership in guilds and the professions. Segregation of Jews into ghettos, forcing them to wear yellow badges identifying them as Jews, a practice revived by the Nazis. And of course, there was the ultimate anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, in which 1/3 of European Jewry was wiped out by the Nazis. 6 million people, along with 5 to 6 million others, including Roma, Slavs, Soviet prisoners of war, disabled people, and communists. So you can see why the Jewish people, a people without a land base, might want a physical homeland, even an actual country. The question is, why in Palestine, the traditional homeland of many peoples, not just Jews? Why not Germany, which had the largest number of Jews before the Holocaust? Why not carve out a Jewish state from Germany as a form of reparations? Why? Because the Western powers planned to reconstruct Germany as an ally in their new crusade against the Soviet Union, choosing an old enemy over a recent ally. And this was possible because when the old Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, Britain and France moved in and divided up the empire into new nation states that it planned to control, similar to the way Britain had divided up India and ruled it through puppet local leaders. For example, Britain drew the boundaries for Saudi Arabia, selected its ruler, and controlled its destiny. It even designed its flag, manufactured it in London, and sent it to the new Saudi government saying, "Here's your flag." But not all peoples got a country, including the Palestinians and the Jews. With the emergence of the Zionist movement in the late 1800s, there was a movement to create a homeland for Jews in historic Palestine. This meant the beginning of a steadily increasing emigration from Europe that was seen as threatening by the indigenous population. It was in this period that tensions between the two peoples became violent. So we're not talking about millennia of conflict between Muslims and Jews, as the mainstream media likes to call it, but a much more recent phenomenon in reaction to Zionist colonization. But Britain and other Western powers were eventually won over to the idea that they would benefit from the essentially Western country being established in the Middle East, which by now was understood to be the source of tremendous wealth because of its vast oil reserves. And whoever controls oil controls the world. This is the basis for modern Western interest in the region, and part of its great hostility toward Iran, which was the first country in the world to nationalize its own oil resources. The result, of course, was the overthrow of Prime Minister Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh by the newly formed CIA in 1953. And so, in 1948, the State of Israel was established in historic Palestine. It wasn't a country that emerged naturally. It was instead a deliberate colonial settler project carried out by Europeans in a land already occupied by other peoples. And as such, in this modern period, it does not have a right to exist. And because of this reality, those of us who live in the countries that support Israel and supply it with a military might to oppress the Palestinian people must do everything in our power to oppose that support, including and especially by promoting the movement to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. To say this is not anti-Semitism. It isn't a call to physically remove Jewish people from Palestine. It isn't a call for violence against Jews. It's simply an acknowledgement that it's unacceptable to have an exclusively Jewish state on land that for thousands of years has been home to many different peoples. So what is the solution? For years, many people believed it would be possible to establish two states in historic Palestine, one for Jews, one for Palestinians. That proposal now seems totally unrealistic, since the Israeli state has done everything it can to drive Palestinians from either the State of Israel or the so-called occupied territories through ethnic cleansing, genocidal military attacks, and the racist settler movement. I need to say something, of course, about the attack on Gaza. President Biden of the United States has said that Israel has the right to defend itself. But the Palestinian people have a right to defend themselves. And when Palestinians, 300 of them, were injured by Israeli police breaking into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Palestinian families are being told that they have no right to live in the homes where they've lived for some 70 years, and now are being told by the Israeli courts that they either must demolish their own homes or pay some $28,000 for the Israeli state to demolish them. This is absolutely and completely unacceptable. And so the military forces of Gaza defended their people by sending rockets into Israel. And Israel responded with a massive air bombing of Gaza, an area that is one of the most heavily concentrated populations in the entire country, that is blockaded by Israel and Egypt. So when it is under attack, there is no place to go. There is no place to hide. They have no air force of their own. They have no air defense systems. They are trapped like fish in a barrel. And I can't get out of my head the video I saw of a little Palestinian girl, and she's standing in a field of rubble, and she said that behind her were the remains of the school that she used to attend, and she pointed down the street to where her home used to be, and she said she has no place to live and no place to go to school and no place to play, and she said, how do you expect me to fix this? I'm 10 years old. Many Palestinians now seem to believe that the only real solution is one state in which Muslims, Christians, and Jews can all live in peace and equality. Is that possible? Time, struggle, and demographics will all play their role. That means my time's up. And history will provide us with the answer. In the meantime, it's the duty of all justice-minded people everywhere to support the just cause of the Palestinian people for self-determination, to have the right to decide for themselves the future of their people, of their nation. This is our duty, our responsibility, and our struggle. Free, free Palestine. Long live the just struggle of the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Phil. There's definitely something to keep in mind, that the effect that Imam Khomeini had on the Middle East, and in particular against Israel and their oppression of Palestinians, is something that can't be overlooked. And in today, I think one of the best ways, like you mentioned, that we, living here in Canada and the US, that we can participate and help support the Palestinians is through the BDS movement. Once again, thank you for all your words so far. We'd like to continue our program with another piece of poetry from Sister Ilsa Zahra. But before that, if I could ask everyone to please recite a Fatiha for the family that was murdered in London earlier this week. I've been informed that the burial is happening just now. If you could all recite a Fatiha for them, and then inshallah after that we'll continue with our poetry. Sister Ilsa, please present your poetry.
Of course. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hope, never hopeless. The world today is achromatic and dark. The colors faded and spirits missing sparks. Around 264 million people in the world are depressed today, and many more join their ranks by the day. But why? What is it that people are missing in the western half of the world today that makes so many people see the world in black and white and gray? Are they missing purpose, direction, or do they simply lack motivation? Do they not get tired of doing the same things over and over again? They must, otherwise they wouldn't fight only for their own personal gain. The elites, the 1%, have everything life has to offer, with luxury, bodyguards, and wealth overflowing from their coffers. And when nothing else quite suffices, too many people are left to their own devices. Is this what a developed country should look like? A developed country living independently should be setting examples for other countries to see, yet we see a semi-developed country which is so strong, built upon a rule of justice and peace and quiet cheer all around. What is it that they have that the West can't see? How are they so optimistic when the world is losing to chaos and greed? Their optimism comes from their own renowned savior, a burning candle in the dark, a wise and just leader. Imam Khomeini brought freedom to those held captive by fear, and reached out to teach those who couldn't be near. He drove away the tyranny of the Shah and taught all of us not to bow to oppression and to those who dare to be unjust. Year after year, we gather to remember the man who was revolutionary in many ways, who, not only overthrew the Shah, but fought laws, haters, and the nays. A man so sincere in his actions that no maltreatment could discourage his efforts to instill in the world the strength that comes from hope and candor, saying, working for the love of God never makes me fatigued. All of us who still live in the lead of Imam Khomeini and his successors know of all he's faced to show us that it's possible to unite in a land of our own. But what would the world look like today had we not been blessed with his rays? Well, we have a ready sample in the youth of the disbelievers. Those either unfortunate enough not to know of those who we revere, or those who can see the signs, recognize their perfection, yet still choose to ignore the clearest of indications. Those who kill entire Muslim families in open places like London, Ontario, reveling in the pain of young orphans who may survive. How lost are such youth? With dead consciousness they are alive. Without a restorative such as the Islamic Revolution, what would ensure that we would remain steadfast on the things taught to us by the Prophet of Allah? What would ensure that we weren't amongst those stumbling blindly in the dark? The human race is too forgetful to be left alone for too long. Proof of that is all around us today, from Palestine to Syria. The world is immersed in sickness and grief, but the oppressors, they won't relent. They won't give the helpless a break. What's the point of all this fighting? When they leave Palestine and Syria, they'll simply find another place to target. They misinterpret the teachings of the religion of peace, driving those who seek solace away from our deen. Right now, it's only them, the Al-Qaeda, the ISIS, the literalists acting this way. But that could be us, trying to put together a puzzle without the bigger picture to guide us. In other words, near impossible, hopeless. So let's take a moment to truly understand the significance of this Islamic representative and thank Allah for this call to the right path. After 1400 years, the message Imam Hussein died for, that Sayyidah Zainab spoke out for, that generations of Imams have brought to us, we have been reminded of it. And we've been reminded that no matter what happens, we need to trust in our Creator. With Him watching over us, we can rest easy and have hope, never hopeless. Salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Thank you, Sister Elsa, for that wonderful poem. There's a lot of points to take out from it, but one of the things that I really liked was how you mentioned the Imam's effect on education. It's definitely one of the things that said is that education is the weapon of the masses. You know, if you want to help people become better, you educate them. And his effect in education, both in Iran and the larger globe in general, especially when it comes to Islam, cannot be overlooked. Inshallah, we'll continue our program with another video. If I could ask the tech team to put that up on the screen, please.
معروف است که میگویند اسکندر مقدونی در یک راهی میگذشت، مردم به او کرنش میکردند. یک مرد پارسای مؤمنی در یک گوشه‌ای نشسته بود، کرنش نکرد، احترام نکرد، بلند نشد. اسکندر تعجب کرد، گفت او رو بیارید. آوردن. گفت تو چرا در مقابل من کرنش نکردی؟ گفت زیرا تو غلام غلامان منی، چرا در مقابل تو کرنش کنم؟ گفت چطور؟ گفت زیرا تو غلام شهوت و غضب خود هستی و شهوت و غضب غلامان منند، در اختیار منند، من بر آنها غالبم. انسان اینجور میشه. اگر عزت نفس در درون لایه‌های عمیق وجود انسان نفوذ کرد، اون وقت شیطان در انسان اثر نمیگذارد، هواهای نفس در انسان اثر نمیگذارد، شهوت و غضب انسان را بازیچه خود قرار نمیده. ما امام رو اینجور شناختیم. امام در طول حیات، چه در حوزه علم و تدریس، چه در حوزه دوران مبارزه دشوار و چه در حوزه مدیریت و حاکمیت، اون وقتی که در رأس کشور قرار گرفت و مدیریت جامعه رو در قبضه گرفت، در همه اینها مصداق و توکل علی العزیز الرحیم بود. برای همین بود که کارهای بزرگ که همه میگفتند نشدنی است، با طلوع امام این کارها شدنی شد. همه سدهایی که گفته میشد شکستنی نیست، با حضور امام این سدها شکستنی شد. او علاوه بر این که خود مظهر عزت نفس و اقتدار معنوی بود، روح عزت را در ملت هم زنده کرد. این کار بزرگ امام بزرگوار بود که من حالا بعد برمیگردم درباره این توضیح خواهم داد. ملت ما با احساس عزتی که از درس‌های انقلاب و امام آموخت، توانست خود را کشف کند. ملت خود را کشف کرد، توانایی‌های خود را کشف کرد و چنین شد که ما در این چند دهه بسیاری از تحقق وعده‌های الهی را با چشم خود دیدیم. چیزهایی رو که در تاریخ می‌خوندیم، در کتاب‌ها می‌دیدیم، در مقابل چشم خودمون مشاهده کردیم. غلبه مستضعفین را بر مستکبرین، بی‌بنیادی قصرهای بظاهر با شکوه مستکبران و بسیاری از حوادث دیگر را در این سالها دیدیم. خب
That was a wonderful video. And again, continuing along the same lines of the first video, self-purification, it can't be overstated. We need to make sure that we are the ones in control of our desires, and it's not the other way around where our desires control us. Inshallah, our final speaker for tonight will be Sheikh Salim Yusuf Ali. Sheikh Salim was born and raised in the US. He completed his bachelor's and master's degrees in computer science at Stanford University. And after graduating in 1999, Sheikh Salim worked in software development in Silicon Valley, and then later as an engineering manager. And then disenchantment with the typical career path and Silicon Valley lifestyle, a desire to learn about Allah, the Quran, and Ahlul Bayt, as well as a ziyarah trip to Iran, led him to change his course in life. And at the end of 2003, he actually left his job and moved to the holy city of Qom to pursue Islamic studies in the Hawza Ilmiya of Qom. He completed his Islamic studies from Al-Mustafa University in Qom, and thereafter he worked with Wali al-Asr School in the Greater Toronto area. Currently, he lectures locally and at various centers around the world. I believe right now he's located in the US. If you could please welcome him with a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My condolences to all of you on the death anniversary of Imam Khomeini, rahmatullahi alayh. And for the sake of his soul and for the souls of all the martyrs and those who sacrificed their lives for the sake of the religion of Islam and the values of truth and justice. And for all the deceased, I would like to request a Surah Al-Fatiha. There's a saying which in Arabic which goes something like this, that عند ذكر الصالحين تنزل الرحمة, that when the righteous are mentioned, the mercy of God descends. And when we look at some of the recent events that have been taking place in the world, definitely we feel the need for God's mercy. And so I want to applaud the organizers of this particular event and all those who gave wonderful speeches and wonderful presentations and poems. Thank you all for your efforts, and thank you all to those who are participating and following online. So the question that was posed is, what would the world look like if it were not for Imam Khomeini, rahmatullahi alayh? And what I wanted to do, and inshallah, I'll keep my comments brief, is I wanted to talk about three aspects of Imam Khomeini's legacy. What are three things that Imam Khomeini taught us? And then we can revisit the question of what would the world look like if it were not for Imam Khomeini. The three topics I'll be mentioning are, number one, social justice. Number two, the power of rational thinking. And the third one is the role of akhlaq. So each one of them I'll be taking up and then inshallah concluding. So the first topic is that of social justice. Imam Khomeini saw the need for a revolution not in terms of what other people might see it. It wasn't just for, God forbid, the acquisition of worldly power or because of a grudge that he had against a certain group or a certain person. But rather, Imam Khomeini's worldview was an Islamic worldview. It was a Quranic worldview. And Imam Khomeini saw that the whole goal of the religions of God, or the religion of God that was sent through in various forms. Today we call them different names, but they were all the same religion, the religion of submission to God, the religion of the oneness of God and calling to his worship. The whole goal of that religion was to establish social justice. Allah says in the Quran in Surah Al-Hadid, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لقد أرسلنا رسلنا بالبينات وأنزلنا معهم الكتاب والحكمة ليكون والميزان ليقوم الناس بالقسط. Allah says that that we sent the prophets, we sent the messengers, and we gave them a book, and we gave them a mizan, we gave them a scale, we gave them a tool by which people would know what's right and what's wrong, what is good and what is bad. And then we gave them hadid, and we gave them iron, and we gave the societies iron so that they could use that as a means of defending these values of truth and the importance of justice by means of iron. And iron, of course, in the form of weapons, iron in the form of technology. The prophets, all of the prophets, they strived, like their efforts were to establish a just society. Imam Khomeini would speak to people, and he would speak in particular to the scholars, and he would say that, look at the prophets as an example. Was their role limited to just explaining like laws? Was it just to invite people in lectures to what's right and what's wrong and leave it at that? Was their job just to call towards like having better ethics and morals? No. In fact, we know that the prophets would stand against the oppressors of the time, and they would not only preach the truth, and they would not only guide people to what's right and what's wrong, but they would insist on a system to enforce that. Because if you don't have that enforcement, if you don't have a way of actually practically applying it on a level of the society, then it remains a type of personal calling, and it will, on a societal level, injustice will continue to reign. Imam Khomeini would quote the hadith that al-fuqaha umana rusul, the jurists, and not just the jurists, but those who have deep knowledge of the religion, they are the trustees of the prophets and the messengers, meaning their job is the same job as the messengers. So they also have to strive towards this establishment of global justice. So for Imam Khomeini, the Islamic government was not an ends, but rather a means towards a greater end, which was social justice. Justice in all aspects of life, when it comes to different classes and in erasing like the difference between the haves and the have-nots, when it comes to erasing the injustice of racial discrimination, when it comes to injustice due to unfair gender discrimination, Imam Khomeini would speak about these matters. And not only leading up to the revolution, but even after the revolution. For example, Imam Khomeini, in one of his speeches, he says that I'm translating and paraphrasing, that he says, I have repeatedly announced and stated that in Islam, culture and language and tribal affiliation and nationality and groupings, they are not in any way something which is important from an Islamic perspective. And that applies, he says, to all Muslims, whether they be Ahlus Sunnah or whether they be Shia. They are brethren and they are equal, and they have equal access to all rights and all advantages in an Islamic system. He would talk to the administrators and the government officials, and he would tell them that your job is not the job of a particular of a typical government official, where you reap the benefits and in your positions you assert authority for the sake of your own selves. He says, rather, you should see yourself as being like a kind father or a kind mother to those people that you are mas'ul and you're responsible to be able to help. Now, in today's world, you hear people talking about social justice, but it's important to understand the type of social justice that Imam Khomeini advocated. I want to explain a few of the differences. Imam Khomeini, first of all, would talk about a social justice which stems from the Islamic principle of adl. And in Islam, the principle of adl is extremely important, but it is the principle which comes after the first principle. And what is the first principle? It's that of Tawheed. It's that of acknowledging the uniqueness and the oneness and the supremacy of Allah, who is the creator and who is the nourisher and the sustainer. And he is the one who has ownership over everyone and everything. And he is the one who is worshipped and ought to be worshipped. Without acknowledging that, any other understanding of social justice will be flawed, because the type of justice that we have is out of respect for and out of acknowledging that ourselves and our possessions and our families and our communities and our societies, all of these belong to God, and it is up to Him to show us the right way of living, the right way of interacting with one another. One of the other characteristics of the justice that Imam Khomeini called for is a type of justice where not only do people strive for establishing justice, but also there is a way for making sure that that justice stays there. How many times we see revolutions or movements, they start out with a lot of slogans, but then they collapse ultimately. And then you look at the situation of the people, perhaps it's worse off than it was before. But Imam Khomeini was foresighted, and he knew that that type of empty call wasn't going to succeed. From the beginning, he was talking about a type of social justice which has a system at its basis, a system of guidance that shows how different rights should be distributed, how they should be upheld. And that was the system of Islam. So it was a justice based on the Islamic values. And the third point is that it was a justice based on individual justice as well. And we have a hadith, for example, from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. He says, غاية العدل أن يعدل المرء في نفسه. That the epitome of justice is when the individual has justice within themselves. Somebody can't be an activist and calling for justice in when it comes to other people's situation or in their local situation, and they can't be true to their call for justice without also striving to establish justice within themselves. And that comes about through acknowledging the principle of Tawheed and the need to adhere to God and to obey Him in all aspects. And also the importance of establishing a type of justice when it comes to our traits and aiming for the perfect balance and aiming for perfection in our akhlaq, in our progression towards Allah. So when we look at the world around us and we see calls for social justice, sometimes they are definitely inspired by the example of Imam Khomeini, because they see some aspects there which appeals to them. For example, they see that Imam Khomeini would call for freedom. He would call against oppression. And it's those things which spark an inspiration for them. But if they want to be able to benefit truly from the message and the legacy of Imam Khomeini, they have to look at the type of social justice that he was speaking about. The second point of the legacy of Imam Khomeini that I want to mention is that of tafakkur and ta'aqqul. Meaning Imam Khomeini taught us the importance of clear and rational thinking in terms of being able to determine what is right and what is wrong. Now, this is a point which has to be discussed, and it's important to identify that there's a difference between the type of thinking that Imam Khomeini was calling for and the type of enlightened or revisionist thinking that sometimes we hear being called for in different forums. In fact, Imam Khomeini sometimes would attack the enlightened thinkers of the time. Not that he was advocating, a type of approach of not thinking or not using our intellect, but rather he was trying to say that thing that you are calling intellect is actually nothing other than your desires packaged up in a pseudo-intellectual framework. Imam Khomeini would proudly and gladly say that I am calling you towards not just a return of back to where we were 100 years ago, but rather a return of back to where we were 1400 years ago. And sometimes people would take issue with that. They'd be like, oh, you're taking us back into the Stone Ages. Imam Khomeini would clarify. He would say that, no, what I'm calling you towards is a return to the adherence of the principles of 1400 years ago, of the justice of 1400 years ago, of the values of 1400 years ago. He clearly stated in one of his speeches that any aspects of civilization since that time, which are truly beneficial and truly in the interest of human beings, we embrace those openly. But don't package up as civilization what is actually a type of modern form of jahiliyyah, of ignorance, of worship of one's low desires. So Imam Khomeini would call us to think and to reflect upon what is it that we're trying to aim for. These, in today's society, there's a lot of, given the current events especially, there's a lot of talk about Islamophobia, and rightly so. It's a threat that needs to be taken seriously, and we mourn with the victims of Islamophobia, whether they be in our local areas or whether they be international. Now, one of the approaches that's sometimes taken to Islamophobia is one which is, again, packaged up in a pseudo-intellectual framework, which is that let's actually step back from our values. Because now it's become dangerous for us, so we need to step back from our tradition in order to be safe. Allah didn't want us to be put in a situation where we're targeted. Now, Imam Khomeini taught us that no, in these type of situations, we have to think deeply, we have to understand, we have to reflect that this is another type of Islamophobia. Rather, we should be even firmer in our tradition, even firmer in terms of our support and our advocating our values and our tradition. And we need to ensure that we take full rights of our presence, just like any other members of this society is their presence, and we need to assert our rights. The third and last point that I wanted to make was regarding the akhlaq of Imam Khomeini. This is one of his legacies, There's a lot that could be said here, but in one of his speeches, he says regarding the success of the Islamic Revolution, he says that there's something that was more valuable than even the success that we had on a geopolitical sphere, which is Fathul Qulub, which is the victory of the hearts. And that was really the point of the revolution, which is to allow the hearts to achieve, tranquility in the remembrance of God. Imam Khomeini himself was an example for us of that. Imam Khomeini was, through his akhlaq, he showed us truly what does Islam call us towards. In one of the things that's narrated from him that always is an inspiration for me is that they say that one time he said that until today, not once have I ever imagined, or never I've never even once felt fear. Now, of course, he felt fear of God's justice, because we all know that if God were to treat us, in a perfect level of justice, then we would never merit his grace. We want his grace, not his justice. But when it came to others, when it came to the superpowers, when it came to his enemies, when it came to those who were trying to assassinate him, not once did he feel fear towards that. And it was this type of connection with God, his akhlaq, his irfan, which was one of his legacies. We know that Allah tells us in the Quran, خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا, human beings have been created weak. So how do we address that? We address that by connecting to God and through worshiping him. And that's the way to success. Allah says in the Quran, وَإِن يَمْسَسْكَ اللَّهُ بِضُرٍّ فَلَا كَاشِفَ لَهُ إِلَّا هُوَ وَإِن يَمْسَسْكَ بِخَيْرٍ فَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. If Allah desires to bestow you with some type of affliction, then none will remove that except for him. But if he wants to give you some goodness, then he is capable over all things. So we saw that in the life of Imam Khomeini, and it was this that inspired others. There was a photographer who was taking pictures of Imam Khomeini, and he says that just by witnessing the Salatul Layl of Imam Khomeini and his tears, I couldn't stop myself crying. There were people who would go in his presence and they would think of all these things of him, things that they had heard in the media, but then they would come out and they'd say that I never met anyone like this. One of them says that I had met the Dalai Lama, the Buddhist monks, the Hindu sages, but none possessed quite the electrifying presence of Imam Khomeini. So to conclude, I want to go back to the question, which was that what would the world look like if it were not for Imam Khomeini? Well, we aren't really qualified to say, because when we look at Imam Khomeini, we don't see him independent of his sustainer and his creator. We know that his goodness and his legacy is one of the blessings of God. And we know that Allah says in the Quran, وَاللَّهُ مُتِمُّ نُورِهِ وَلَوْ كَرِهَ الْكَافِرُونَ. Allah will complete his light, even if those who disbelieve and stubbornly would like to oppose that. Allah says in the Quran, وَاللَّهُ الْغَنِي وَأَنْتُمُ الْفُقَرَاء. Allah is the one who possesses everything and you are the ones who are needy. وَإِن تَتَوَلَّوْا يَسْتَبْدِلْ قَوْمًا غَيْرَكُمْ ثُمَّ لَا يَكُونُوا أَمْثَالَكُمْ. If you turn back, then Allah will replace you with another people, and then they will not be like you. So really, the question now that Imam Khomeini has departed is that what is our responsibility? Allah will carry out his acts. Allah will eventually establish justice through his people. But what is it that we are going to do? And the question comes up that now that we have this great legacy, we have this great example of this being who was alive either during our lives or the lives of the previous generation. We know this was a living world, a real world example of what somebody can accomplish when they become, they take the path of God and they achieve success in that respect. Now the question is that what are we going to do? Thank you very much, and may Allah Ta'ala bless you all, and may He protect the legacy of Imam Khomeini rahmatullahi alayhi, and may He guide us all towards performing our responsibilities. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa alihi at-tahirin.
Thank you so much, Sheikh Salim. It was a pleasure seeing you again and hearing from you again. Inshallah, we'll be able to benefit from you in the future as well. As we head towards the end of our program, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today and speaking about different aspects of the world that could have been vastly different were it not for Imam Khomeini. I'd also like to thank all of you who joined us from home and have been tuning into our live stream. As we end, I'd like to ask that we all recite a Fatiha for all of our leaders who've passed away, and in particular Imam Khomeini, as well as all those who have been killed in the way of Islam, including the family murdered in London, Ontario, and the dear ones of all the volunteers who made this program possible, especially including Brother Sultan Ali, who was one of our longtime volunteers and supporters and passed away a few days ago. To completely end today's program, I'd like to ask Brother Bilal to lead us in reciting the dua for the safety and reappearance of Imam Zamana.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم كن لوليك الحجة بن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرزك توعا وتمتعه فيها تبيلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Thank you so much once again to everyone who's joined us for today, and we look forward to seeing you in our next programs. Take care.